Margaret Thompson wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished scrubbing the last bathroom tile. Her knees ached from kneeling on the cold marble floor, but she couldn't afford to complain. At 45, her body wasn't what it used to be, yet she still had 3 more houses to clean before the day ended. She had been cleaning Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth's mansion every Tuesday and Friday for 8 long years. The grand house with its crystal chandeliers and expensive paintings always made her feel small. But Mrs. Ashworth was different from her other wealthy clients. While most rich people barely noticed Margaret existed, Eleanor would always greet her with a warm smile and ask about her day. "How's your daughter doing in school, dear?" Eleanor would ask, remembering that Margaret's 16-year-old daughter Lucy was struggling with her math grades. Sometimes Eleanor would even leave small gifts, a book for Lucy or homemade cookies wrapped in pretty paper. These small gestures meant the world to Margaret, who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table and pay rent for their tiny apartment. The news of Eleanor's death hit Margaret harder than she expected. She had arrived at the mansion that Tuesday morning to find police cars and an ambulance outside. A neighbor told her that Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 78. Margaret stood there on the sidewalk, tears rolling down her cheeks, grieving for the kind woman who had treated her like a human being rather than just hired help. 3 days later, something strange happened. Margaret was sorting through her mail after another exhausting day of cleaning when she found an official-looking envelope with her name written in fancy lettering. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a formal letter from a law firm called Hartwell & Associates, requesting her presence at the reading of Eleanor Ashworth's last will and testament. Margaret read the letter 3 times, certain there had been some mistake. Why would they want her there? She was just the cleaning lady. Surely this invitation was meant for someone else with the same name. She almost threw the letter away, thinking it was some kind of cruel joke. But something in her heart told her to go. Eleanor had always been so thoughtful, so caring. Maybe she had left a small thank you gift for Margaret's years of service. Maybe $100 or some old clothes. Margaret had heard that rich people sometimes remembered their housekeepers in their wills with tiny amounts of money. The problem was, Margaret didn't own anything nice enough to wear to such an important meeting. Her closet contained only work, clothes, faded jeans, old t-shirts, and her cleaning uniforms. She called her sister Beth, the only family member she could turn to for help. "You need to borrow what?" Beth asked over the phone, sounding surprised. "A dress," Margaret repeated, feeling embarrassed. "Something appropriate for a lawyer's office. Mrs. Ashworth left me something in her will and they want me to come to the reading." Beth was quiet for a moment. "Maggie, are you sure this isn't some kind of scam? Rich people don't usually remember the help in their wills." "I know it sounds crazy," Margaret admitted, "but Mrs. Ashworth was always kind to me. Maybe she left me a small gift or something personal. I just feel like I should go and pay my respects." Beth sighed. "All right, I have one decent black dress. It might be a little big on you, but it'll have to do." The next morning, Margaret stood in front of her cracked bathroom mirror, adjusting Beth's borrowed dress. It was indeed too big, hanging loosely on her thin frame, but it was clean and respectable. She had spent her last $20 on a pair of black shoes from the thrift store, hoping they would last through the day without falling apart. As she waited for the bus, Margaret's mind wandered to all the conversations she'd had with Eleanor over the years. Unlike Eleanor's own children, who rarely visited, Margaret had listened to Eleanor's stories about her late husband, her travels around the world, and her disappointment in how materialistic her family had become. "Money changes people, dear," Eleanor had once told Margaret while she was dusting the family photos. "My children used to visit all the time when they were young. Now they only call when they need something. It's quite sad, really." Margaret had always wondered why Eleanor seemed so lonely in such a big, beautiful house. Now she understood. Eleanor's children, Victoria and Charles, lived their own busy lives in the city, too important to spend time with their aging mother. Margaret had seen them maybe 5 times in 8 years, and each visit had been brief and tense. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes, giving Margaret plenty of time to worry. What if she said something wrong? What if Eleanor's family was angry that the cleaning lady had been invited to such a private family moment? Margaret had learned to be invisible in rich people's homes, cleaning quietly and efficiently without drawing attention to herself. The law offices of Hartwell and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper. Margaret felt intimidated as she entered the marble lobby with its expensive artwork and well-dressed business people hurrying past. The elevator seemed to take forever to reach the 15th floor, and with each passing floor, Margaret's nervousness grew. When the elevator doors opened, Margaret found herself facing a reception area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a law office. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and an expensive suit, looked up from her computer screen. "I'm here for the Ashworth will reading," Margaret said quietly, showing her invitation. The receptionist checked her list and nodded. "Right this way, please." As they walked down a long hallway lined with oil paintings of serious-looking men in judicial robes, Margaret caught sight of herself in a mirror. She looked exactly like what she was, a working-class woman in borrowed clothes, completely out of place in this world of wealth and power. The receptionist stopped in front of heavy wooden doors. "The reading will begin shortly. Please take a seat anywhere you'd like." Margaret thanked her and stepped into the conference room, immediately feeling every eye in the room turn toward her. The space was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city, and a massive table surrounded by leather chairs. About 15 people were already seated, all dressed in expensive black clothing that screamed money and status. She recognized Eleanor's children immediately. Victoria, now in her early 50s, sat at the head of the table wearing a designer black dress that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. Her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup couldn't hide the cold calculation in her eyes as she surveyed the room like a queen holding court. Charles, Eleanor's younger son, looked every bit the successful businessman in his tailored black suit. He was checking his phone constantly, clearly annoyed at having to spend time on family matters when he could be making money at his investment firm. The whispers started immediately. "Why is she here? Isn't that the cleaning woman? This is highly inappropriate." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she made her way to an empty chair in the back corner, trying to make herself as small as possible. She could feel Victoria's icy stare boring into her, and Charles looked up from his phone with obvious irritation. "Excuse me?" Victoria called out in a voice dripping with disdain. "I believe there's been some mistake. This is a private family matter." Margaret opened her mouth to explain about the invitation, but before she could speak, the doors opened again, and Mr. Hartwell, the family attorney, entered with his briefcase and a thick folder of documents. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said in a professional tone. "Thank you all for coming. Shall we begin?" Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, but Victoria wasn't finished with her complaints. She stood up from her chair, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor as she pointed directly at Margaret. "I'm sorry, but I must insist," Victoria said, her voice getting louder. "This woman has no business being here. She's the hired help, not family. This is completely inappropriate." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She clutched her purse tighter, wishing she could disappear into the expensive leather chair. All around the room, Eleanor's relatives were staring at her with a mixture of confusion and disgust, as if she were some kind of unwelcome insect that had crawled into their pristine world. Mother always was too soft with the staff, Charles muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. He looked at Margaret like she was something unpleasant he'd stepped in. Probably filled her head with sob stories about needing money. Margaret's cheeks burned with shame and anger. She had never asked Eleanor for anything beyond her regular wages. Not once in 8 years had she complained about her problems or hinted that she needed financial help. She had always kept their conversations light and friendly, asking about Eleanor's day and listening to her stories. Mr. Hartwell raised his hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your confusion, but I assure you that everyone in this room was specifically requested to be here by Mrs. Ashworth herself. Now, if we could please proceed with the reading." Victoria's face turned red, but she sat back down, shooting Margaret a look that could have frozen water. The whispers around the table grew louder. "This is ridiculous," someone muttered. "What could Mother have been thinking? The woman probably manipulated her somehow. Margaret wanted to stand up and leave. She didn't belong here among these people, with their expensive clothes and cold hearts. But something kept her in her seat. Maybe it was the memory of Eleanor's kindness, or maybe it was the stubborn streak that had helped her survive years of working multiple jobs to support her daughter. Whatever it was, she decided to stay. Charles leaned back in his chair and checked his expensive watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He had already calculated in his head how much money he expected to inherit. The family mansion alone was worth at least $3 million, and then there were the investments, the jewelry, and his mother's substantial savings account. Split between him and Victoria, it would be enough to secure his children's college funds and maybe buy that vacation home in the mountains he'd been wanting. "Can we please get on with this?" Charles said impatiently. "Some of us have important meetings to get back to." Victoria nodded in agreement. She had already mentally redecorated the family mansion, planning which rooms she would update first. The old place needed a complete renovation to bring it into the modern age. She was thinking about selling some of the antique furniture that Eleanor had been so attached to. It was all so outdated and wouldn't fit with Victoria's contemporary style. Around the table sat various other family members, cousins, nieces, and nephews who had driven in from different cities for the will reading. Most of them hadn't seen Eleanor in years, but they all remembered her generosity at Christmas and birthdays. They were expecting decent-sized gifts, maybe enough to pay off some credit card debt or take a nice vacation. Margaret noticed how none of them seemed particularly sad about Eleanor's death. There were no tears, no stories being shared about happy memories with their beloved relative. Instead, everyone looked eager and impatient, like children waiting to open presents on Christmas morning. It made Margaret's heart ache. During those 8 years of cleaning Eleanor's house, she had seen the loneliness in the older woman's eyes. Eleanor would light up whenever Margaret arrived, grateful for someone to talk to who actually listened. She would share stories about her late husband, worry about her garden, or ask Margaret's advice about small household matters. "My children are so busy these days," Eleanor had told Margaret just a few months before her death. "I understand, of course. They have their own lives to live, but sometimes I wish they would just call to say hello, not because they need something from me." Margaret had wanted to tell Eleanor that her children didn't deserve her kindness, but she had kept her thoughts to herself. It wasn't her place to comment on family matters. Now, sitting in this cold conference room surrounded by Eleanor's greedy relatives, Margaret wished she had told Eleanor how much their friendship had meant to her. Victoria was studying her manicured nails, already planning her shopping trip for new furniture. She had never understood her mother's attachment to that old house with its outdated wallpaper and heavy antique furniture. The place was like a museum frozen in time. Victoria preferred modern, clean lines and contemporary art. "I suppose we'll need to have the house appraised quickly," Victoria whispered to Charles. "The real estate market is quite good right now." Charles nodded. "I've already spoken to a few investment advisors about how to handle the portfolio. Mother was too conservative with her investments. We could have been making much more money all these years." Margaret overheard their conversation and felt sick. These people were talking about Eleanor's death like it was a business transaction. They were already making plans to sell the home Eleanor had loved, the place where she had raised her children and spent 50 years of marriage with her beloved husband. Mr. Hartwell shuffled through his papers, organizing them in the precise order he would need for the reading. He had been Eleanor's attorney for over 20 years, and he had watched her children's visits become less and less frequent as they got older. He remembered when Victoria and Charles were young, how they used to spend summers at the mansion, playing in the garden and helping their mother bake cookies. Now they were successful adults who saw their mother primarily as a source of future inheritance. It saddened him, but it wasn't uncommon among wealthy families. Money had a way of changing relationships, often not for the better. The attorney had tried to convince Eleanor to reconsider some of her decisions when she had updated her will 6 months ago, but she had been absolutely firm in her choices. She knew exactly what she wanted to do and why. Mr. Hartwell had to admit that Eleanor's reasoning made sense, even if it would certainly cause an uproar. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair as more family members continued to stare at her with obvious disapproval. She could hear them whispering among themselves, speculating about why she was there and what Eleanor might have left her. Probably just some old jewelry or dishes, one cousin suggested. Maybe a small cash gift for good service. Another added, Mother always was sentimental about the help, Victoria said dismissively. The casual cruelty of their comments made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. These people had no idea how much Eleanor's friendship had meant to her. They didn't know about the times Eleanor had asked about Margaret's daughter's school problems, or how she always remembered Margaret's birthday with a card and a small gift. They didn't know that Eleanor had been the only person in Margaret's life who had ever made her feel valued and respected, despite the difference in their social status. To them, Margaret was just a servant who had somehow managed to worm her way into their family business. Mr. Hartwell finally looked up from his papers and surveyed the room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and he knew it was about to get much worse. Now then, he said in his calm, professional voice, let us begin with the last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Ashworth. Mr. Hartwell began reading in his steady, professional voice. The room fell silent except for the occasional rustle of expensive clothing and the soft ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Margaret tried to make herself even smaller in her chair, still feeling out of place among all these wealthy people who clearly didn't want her there. I, Eleanor Margaret Ashworth, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my earthly possessions as follows, the lawyer began, his words echoing in the large conference room. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming silently on the polished table. Charles put away his phone and actually paid attention for the first time since arriving. Around the table, various cousins and relatives straightened in their chairs, all waiting to hear their names called. To my dear cousin Patricia, I leave my collection of vintage jewelry, including the pearl necklace that belonged to our grandmother. Mr. Hartwell continued. Patricia, a woman in her 60s wearing an expensive black suit, smiled with satisfaction. The jewelry collection was worth at least $50,000. She had always admired those pieces and was pleased that Eleanor had remembered her fondness for them. To my nephew Robert, I leave my late husband's vintage car collection, including the 1967 Mustang and the 1955 Chevrolet. Robert grinned and nudged his wife. Those cars were worth a fortune, especially the Mustang that Eleanor's husband had restored himself. Robert was already thinking about which car shows he could enter them in. The reading continued with various, smaller gifts. Artwork went to one cousin, rare books to another, and Eleanor's fine china set to a niece who had once complimented it during a holiday dinner years ago. Each person who received something looked pleased and relieved. Victoria and Charles exchanged confident glances. These were just the smaller gifts, the appetizers before the main course. Soon they would hear about the house, the investments, and the bulk of their mother's money. They had been patient, and now their patience would be rewarded. Margaret listened to each bequest with growing confusion. Eleanor had been so thoughtful, remembering small details about what each person had admired or appreciated. It made Margaret wonder what Eleanor might have left for her. Maybe some books, since Eleanor knew Margaret loved to read, or perhaps some of Eleanor's homemade recipe cards, since she had always complimented Eleanor's cooking. To my gardener, Frank, who has maintained my roses with such care for 15 years, I leave $10,000 in my gardening tools, so he might start his own landscaping business as he has always dreamed. This surprised everyone. $10,000 for the gardener? Victoria's eyebrows shot up. That seemed like an awful lot of money for someone who just cut grass and trimmed bushes, but she wasn't too concerned. There was still plenty of money left for the real inheritors. To my housekeeper, Ruth, who has kept my home spotless and beautiful for 12 years, I leave $15,000 and my grandmother's silver tea set. Now Charles was starting to look a bit annoyed. $15,000 for the housekeeper? His mother was being far too generous with the help. That money could have been put to much better use by family members who actually needed it. Margaret's heart pounded as she heard these generous gifts to Eleanor's other employees. If Eleanor was giving $10,000 and $15,000 to her other workers, what might she have left for Margaret, who had worked for her the longest? Mr. Hartwell paused to turn the page, and the silence in the room became almost unbearable. This was it. The moment everyone had been waiting for. The house, the investments, the real money. Victoria sat up straighter, preparing to hear her name connected to millions of dollars. To my daughter Victoria, I leave my collection of first edition books, my mother's diamond ring, and the sum of $100,000. Victoria blinked in confusion. 100,000. That was it? What about the house? What about the rest of the money? She looked at Charles, who appeared equally puzzled. To my son Charles, I leave my husband's collection of rare coins, his gold watch, and the sum of $100,000. Charles's mouth fell open. $100,000? He had been expecting millions. Where was the rest of it? Where was the house? Where were the investments that he knew his mother had been building for decades? The room buzzed with confused whispers. Family members looked at each other with questioning expressions. Victoria's face was turning red, and Charles looked like he might be sick. I don't understand, Victoria said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. Where's the house? Where are the investments? Where's the rest of Mother's money? Mr. Hartwell held up his hand for silence. Please let me continue. There is more. Margaret's hands were trembling in her lap. She had never heard such large amounts of money mentioned in her entire life. $100,000 was more money than she could earn in 5 years of cleaning houses. If Eleanor had left her even a few $1,000s, it would change her life completely. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading. For the remainder of my estate, including my home at 1247 Elm Street, my investment portfolio with Hartwell Financial Services, my savings accounts, and all other assets not previously mentioned, I leave to someone who has shown me more genuine kindness and friendship than anyone else in my final years. Victoria was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. Charles had gone completely pale. The rest of the family leaned forward, straining to hear who could possibly be receiving the bulk of Eleanor's fortune. This person never asked me for anything, never made me feel like a burden, and never treated me as anything less than a friend, despite our different circumstances. She listened to my stories, remembered my concerns, and brought joy to my lonely days with her warm smile and caring heart. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. The description sounded like it could be her, but that was impossible. Eleanor wouldn't leave her entire fortune to the cleaning lady. That kind of thing only happened in fairy tales, not in real life. Therefore, I leave the remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $3.2 million, to Margaret Thompson. The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret felt like the room was spinning around her. She must have heard wrong. There was no way Eleanor had just left her millions of dollars. Then Victoria exploded. What? She screamed, jumping to her feet so fast her chair fell over backward. This is impossible. This is insane. She's nobody. She's the cleaning lady. Charles stood up too, his face now bright red with rage. This has to be a mistake. There's no way Mother would leave everything to a stranger. She manipulated her, Victoria shrieked, pointing at Margaret with a shaking finger. She took advantage of a lonely old woman. This is fraud. The room erupted into chaos. Family members were shouting over each other, demanding explanations, claiming the will must be fake. Someone accused Margaret of brainwashing Eleanor. Another person suggested she had forged the documents. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't process what was happening. The shouting around her seemed to come from far away, like she was underwater. $3 million? It was impossible. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of having. She probably poisoned Mother's mind against us, Charles shouted, filled her head with lies about her own family. This will never stand up in court, Victoria declared. We'll fight this. We'll prove she manipulated Mother. Mr. Hartwell was trying to restore order, but the family members were too enraged to listen. They surrounded Margaret's chair, their faces twisted with anger and disbelief, shouting accusations and threats. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. I never asked her for anything. I just cleaned her house. But her words were lost in the chaos of angry voices. all united now in their hatred for the simple woman who had somehow inherited everything they believed was rightfully theirs. Mr. Hartwell stood up and raised both hands, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sharp knife. "Silence," he commanded with an authority that surprised everyone in the room. The shouting died down, though angry mutters continued to ripple through the crowd of Eleanor's relatives. "There is more," the lawyer said firmly, holding up a sealed envelope. Mrs. Ashworth left a personal letter explaining her decision. "I believe you all need to hear it." Victoria was shaking with rage, her expensive makeup smeared from angry tears. "I don't care what kind of lies she wrote. That woman manipulated my mother. No sane person leaves millions of dollars to their cleaning lady." "Your mother was completely sane," Mr. Hartwell replied calmly. "In fact, she anticipated your reaction. That's why she left this letter." Charles was pacing behind his chair like a caged animal. "This is ridiculous. We're her children, her blood. How could she choose a stranger over her own family?" Margaret sat motionless in her chair, still trying to process what had happened. The angry voices around her seemed distant and unreal. Part of her wondered if this was all some terrible dream, and she would wake up in her small apartment, getting ready for another day of cleaning houses. Mr. Hartwell carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several pages written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. Margaret recognized it immediately. She had seen Eleanor writing letters and making notes many times over the years. "This letter is dated 6 months ago," the lawyer announced. "Mrs. Ashworth wrote it in her own hand, and I have witnesses who can verify that she was of completely sound mind when she made these decisions." He cleared his throat and began to read Eleanor's words. Her voice seemed to fill the room, speaking from beyond the grave with a clarity that made everyone fall silent. "To my family and friends gathered for the reading of my will, I know my decisions will come as a shock. You are probably wondering how I could leave my fortune to Margaret Thompson instead of my own children. Let me explain." Victoria's face went white. Charles stopped pacing and stared at the lawyer with growing dread. "For the past several years, I have watched my family visit me only when they needed something. Victoria, you came to see me twice last year. Once to ask for money for your daughter's wedding, and once to suggest I sell this house and move to a retirement home so you could have the money early." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked around the room desperately, but everyone was staring at her with new understanding. "Charles, your visits were even less frequent. You called me every few months, usually to give me advice about my investments or to hint that I was being too generous with my donations to charity. You seemed to think I was wasting money that should be saved for your inheritance." Charles's face had turned a deep shade of red. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Eleanor's letter continued, and Mr. Hartwell's voice carried every word clearly through the stunned silence. "I want you all to know that I was not fooled by your sudden attention when my health began to decline. The calls became more frequent, the visits lasted longer, but I could see the calculation in your eyes. You were not visiting a beloved mother and grandmother. You were checking on your investment." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Eleanor's pain. She had always sensed that Eleanor was lonely, but she hadn't realized how deeply her own family had hurt her. In contrast, Margaret Thompson never asked me for a single thing in 8 years. Not once did she hint that she needed money, even though I could see she was struggling. When her daughter needed school supplies, Margaret worked extra jobs rather than ask for help. When her car broke down and she had to take 3 buses to reach my house, she never complained or asked for assistance. The room was completely quiet now. Even Victoria had stopped her angry muttering to listen. Margaret listened to my stories about your father, even though she must have heard them dozens of times. She remembered my concerns about my garden, my worries about my health, my sadness about feeling forgotten by my own family. She never made me feel like a burden or an interruption in her busy day. Mr. Hartwell paused to turn the page, and Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. When I was sick with pneumonia last winter, Margaret brought me homemade soup without being asked. She called to check on me, even on days when she wasn't scheduled to clean. She treated me with kindness and respect, not because she wanted something from me, but because that's the kind of person she is. Several family members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They remembered Eleanor's illness, but none of them had visited until she was nearly recovered. I have been planning this decision for over a year. I consulted with doctors, psychiatrists, and legal experts to make sure no one could claim I was not in my right mind. I am leaving my fortune to Margaret because she showed me genuine love and friendship when my own family showed me only greed and indifference. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as a broken whisper. Mother, we loved you. We were just busy with our own lives. But Eleanor's letter wasn't finished. Mr. Hartwell continued reading her words from beyond the grave. Victoria, I heard you on the phone with Charles last Christmas, discussing how long you thought I might live and whether you should encourage me to spend more money on myself, so there would be less to split between you. You thought I was napping, but I heard every word. Victoria covered her face with her hands, finally understanding that her mother had known exactly what kind of people her children had become. Charles, I know you hired a private investigator to look into my finances and my will last year. You wanted to make sure I wasn't giving too much money to charity. You were more concerned about your inheritance than about my happiness or well-being. Charles slumped in his chair, looking defeated. He had thought he was being clever and careful, but his mother had known about his scheming all along. I am not doing this to punish you, though I admit I am disappointed in the people you have become. I am doing this because Margaret deserves to be rewarded for her kindness. She has worked multiple jobs for years, struggling to provide for her daughter, while never losing her dignity or her compassion for others. Margaret was crying openly now, overwhelmed by Eleanor's words and the magnitude of what was happening to her life. Margaret, if you are hearing this, please know that your friendship meant everything to me in my final years. You gave me something my own family could not. Genuine care and companionship without expecting anything in return. Use this gift wisely, and remember that money cannot buy the kind of heart you already possess. The letter concluded with Eleanor's signature and the date, witnessed by her doctor and 2 nurses who had confirmed her mental clarity at the time of writing. The conference room remained silent for a long moment after Mr. Hartwell finished reading. Everyone was processing the devastating truth of Eleanor's words, that she had seen through their fake affection and recognized Margaret's genuine friendship for what it was. Finally, Victoria spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She really knew, didn't she? She knew exactly what we were doing. Mr. Hartwell nodded solemnly. Your mother was a very wise woman. She understood people better than you gave her credit for. The days following the will reading felt like a whirlwind to Margaret. She had returned to her small apartment that evening, still wearing her sister's borrowed dress, and sat on her old couch staring at the wall for hours. $3 million. The number seemed impossible, like something from a movie rather than real life. Her daughter Lucy had come home from school to find her mother crying in the kitchen. Mom, what's wrong? Did something happen at work? Margaret had tried to explain, but the words seemed too crazy to speak out loud. Mrs. Ashworth, the lady I cleaned for, she left me some money in her will. That's nice, Mom. How much? A lot, sweetheart. More than we ever dreamed of. But even as Margaret spoke the words, part of her didn't believe it was real. Surely someone would discover a mistake. Surely Eleanor's family would find a way to take it all back. She was right about one thing. Victoria and Charles weren't giving up without a fight. Within a week, Margaret received a certified letter from one of the most expensive law firms in the city. Victoria and Charles had hired 3 different attorneys and were challenging the will on multiple grounds. They claimed Eleanor had been mentally incompetent, that Margaret had used undue influence, and that the will was fraudulent. Margaret's hands shook as she read the legal papers filled with complicated words she didn't understand. They were accusing her of terrible things: manipulation, fraud, even elder abuse. The papers made it sound like she was some kind of criminal who had tricked a helpless old woman. She called Mr. Hartwell immediately, panic rising in her voice. They're saying I manipulated Mrs. Ashworth. They want to take me to court. What if they win? What if I have to pay them back money I don't even have yet? Mr. Hartwell's calm voice reassured her. Margaret, take a deep breath. Eleanor anticipated this would happen. She spent months preparing for exactly this situation. We have everything we need to defend her wishes. What Margaret didn't know was just how thoroughly Eleanor had planned for this battle. 6 months before her death, Eleanor had quietly begun documenting everything. She had video recordings of herself explaining her decision, made while her doctor confirmed she was in perfect mental health. She had recorded conversations with Margaret, showing their natural, friendly relationship with no signs of manipulation or pressure. Eleanor had even hired a private investigator of her own to document her children's behavior. The investigator had recorded Victoria and Charles discussing their mother's will, their expectations of inheriting millions, and their annoyance at having to visit her. The recordings painted a clear picture of 2 grown children who saw their mother primarily as a source of future wealth. Dr. Patricia Williams, Eleanor's longtime physician, had written a detailed report about Eleanor's mental state. Mrs. Ashworth was one of the sharpest, most mentally alert patients I have ever treated, the doctor wrote. She understood exactly what she was doing and why. Her decision was made with complete clarity and sound reasoning. The nurses who had witnessed Eleanor's will also provided statements. They described how Eleanor had carefully explained her decision to them, showing no signs of confusion or mental decline. She had specifically asked them to witness the document because she knew her family would try to challenge it. Meanwhile, Victoria and Charles were learning that money couldn't buy them the kind of evidence they needed. Their lawyers interviewed Eleanor's neighbors, her doctors, and anyone else who had contact with her in her final years. Every single person told the same story. Eleanor had been mentally sharp, independent, and clearly disappointed in her children's behavior. Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor's next-door neighbor for 20 years, was particularly helpful to Margaret's case. Eleanor used to tell me how much she looked forward to Margaret's visits, she testified. She said Margaret was the only person who treated her like a friend instead of a bank account. The legal battle dragged on for 8 months. During that time, Margaret continued cleaning houses, afraid to change her life until everything was settled. She lived in constant fear that a judge would decide she wasn't worthy of Eleanor's gift and take it all away. Victoria and Charles spent over $200,000 on legal fees, money that came out of their own inheritance. Their expensive lawyers found no evidence of fraud, manipulation, or mental incompetence. In fact, the more they investigated, the stronger Eleanor's case became. The breakthrough came when Eleanor's private investigator turned over his recordings to Margaret's legal team. In one particularly damaging recording, Victoria could be heard telling Charles, "We need to figure out how to get Mother to spend less money on stupid charities and save more for us. Maybe we should suggest she's getting too old to make these kinds of decisions herself." In another recording, Charles was heard complaining to his wife about his mother's wasteful spending and saying, "I can't wait until we can take control of her finances and invest that money properly." When these recordings were played in court, Victoria and Charles's case collapsed completely. The judge listened to Eleanor's own voice explaining her decision, read the medical reports confirming her mental clarity, and reviewed the evidence of her children's greed. Mrs. Ashworth clearly understood the consequences of her decision, Judge Martinez ruled. She was mentally competent, acted without coercion, and had valid reasons for her choices. This court sees no evidence of fraud or manipulation. The will stands as written. Margaret was sitting in the back of the courtroom when the judge made his ruling. She had been too nervous to eat breakfast that morning, and she felt dizzy with relief when she heard the words. It was over. Eleanor's gift was really hers. Victoria stormed out of the courtroom without looking at Margaret, her expensive heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. Charles followed behind her, his face red with embarrassment and rage. They had lost everything. Not just the inheritance they expected, but also their public reputation and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Margaret's life changed slowly at first. She was careful with the money, afraid to spend much too quickly. She paid off her debts, bought a reliable car, and moved to a small but comfortable house in a safe neighborhood. For the first time in years, she didn't have to work 3 jobs just to survive. The most important change was for her daughter Lucy. Margaret enrolled her in a better school and hired a tutor to help with math. Lucy's grades improved dramatically when she didn't have to worry about whether they could afford school supplies or if they might have to move again because they couldn't pay rent. "Mom, are you sure this is all real?" Lucy asked one evening as they sat in their new living room. "Sometimes I feel like I'm going to wake up and we'll be back in the old apartment." Margaret smiled and hugged her daughter. "It's real, sweetheart. Mrs. Ashworth wanted to help us have a better life, and now we can help other people too." That's exactly what Margaret did. She used part of Eleanor's gift to establish a scholarship fund for children from working families, kids whose parents cleaned houses and worked multiple jobs just like she had. She called it the Eleanor Ashworth Kindness Scholarship, awarded to students who showed both academic promise and genuine compassion for others. Margaret also hired Lucy's former babysitter as her personal assistant and paid for the young woman's college tuition. She helped her sister Beth start a small business and quietly paid medical bills for elderly neighbors who couldn't afford their medications. But Margaret never forgot her roots. She continued to live modestly, drive a simple car, and shop for clothes at reasonable stores. The money hadn't changed who she was. It had just given her the freedom to be more generous with others. 5 years after Eleanor's death, Margaret stood in the garden of the mansion she now owned, tending to Eleanor's beloved roses. She had kept the house exactly as Eleanor left it, a shrine to a woman who had seen goodness where others saw only an opportunity. Sometimes Margaret would sit in Eleanor's favorite chair and imagine what her friend would think of how the money was being used. She knew Eleanor would be proud of the scholarship fund, the quiet acts of generosity, and the way Margaret had stayed true to herself despite her changed circumstances. The greatest victory wasn't the money. It was the validation that kindness and genuine human connection matter more than blood relations or social status. Eleanor had seen Margaret's true worth when no one else would, and in doing so, she had changed both their lives forever.